During this global pandemic and era of social distancing, I've been doing my interviews from home. This is where I spoke with Robert, who is a professor of African American Studies at nearby Georgetown University. Robert, let's talk a little bit about symbols and statues because they're important. The Civil War, and I want to get your perspective because I think about the Civil War and Jefferson Davis did not win.
Right.
So talk to me about this environment and about the importance of symbols and statues as well.
Absolutely. So here's the thing. So symbols matter because, well, they matter for a couple of reasons, but one of the main reasons is because they honor, whatever it is that they're memorializing, and they place that object, or in this case, that person or these people, on a pedestal to say that they are worthy of being remembered in an honorable way. And so when we look at the Confederate monuments as an example, part of what those symbols are indicating or revealing is a praise for the Confederacy and what it stood for. And so you have people who might say, oh, this is an example of states' rights and it's important for states to have autonomy, but that again is obfuscation. Because what they are saying is that slavery as a way of life, which is what the Confederacy was also arguing to uphold, is a path forward. And so when you look at someone like the current president, retweeting white power videos saying that there's equal perspective, there's good people on both sides, part of what he is doing is explicitly not repudiating white supremacy, but it's also a wink and a nod that says, yes, I support white supremacy, and this is the way we're actually going to do it. And so I think that is kind of what is at stake, or those are some of the stakes of this conversation.
It's interesting, we talked about statues and symbols, but one of the things I heard you talking about, which I want you to kind of maybe riff off on a little bit, because it got me thinking, is imagery. We look at an image and we see something and it jumps out at us. Right. And what you said about George Floyd, I thought it was so telling. It's not just one image of George Floyd. Right. It's the image of this police officer, so cavalier, I can get away with this. It's two images that really kind of jar the mentality.
In the juxtaposition of those images, right? Because I always think of this as sort of being this is emblematic of white supremacy's callous indifference to black life and black suffering. And that in that moment you see it. So what's happening there is that this is not some random backwoods, no one's watching, I'm shocked I was taped and I was found out. This is an incident where Chauvin knows he is being taped on several sides, right? And he literally does not care. And historically, one of the challenges that black people had in proving, police abuse, police assault, police misconduct was that there wasn't evidence. But we know that that's a false claim because even when there is evidence, even when there are videos that show this callous indifference, that is, to my mind, connected to images that permeate our culture, that have historically been a part of our culture since D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, where the dehumanization of black people materializes in how they're treated in actual life and one-on-one encounters, how they are treated in public policy. There is a disregard, or at least a not caring for, that then plays out in very specific ways. And so the dehumanization of black people across culture, be it film, television, representations on boxes, this whole Aunt Jemima discussion, right, are rooted in larger stereotypes about black people's willingness and ability to serve, black people's willingness or inability to occupy certain positions in life. And those ideas, those representations, the histories behind those all matter and play into part of what we're seeing in this moment.
Robert is a professor of African American Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He has published 2 books and is currently working on a 3rd.
They tackle different subjects, including the legacies of slavery, racial equality, and civil rights.
Currently, I'm working on a book titled Black Equity, Black Equality, Reparation, in Black Communities. And part of what I am thinking about in that book is how do we achieve equity and move beyond these conversations around equality, which think about sameness and everyone getting the same portion, whereas equity focuses more on the portion one needs in order to have parity, right? And so the example here is that if you start at 6 and I start at 3, it might be fair to give us both 2, but that doesn't account for the fact that you're starting at 6 and I'm starting at 3. So I need 5 to get me to 6, and then we can talk about how we move forward to 10. And I'm looking at a variety of sources. I do think that Black cultural production, be that literature, music, film, etc., is a very important venue of where to reimagine the world, to make the world anew. Oftentimes, social sciences, sociology, political science have dominated these discussions about paths forward for equity. I think that they're important, but I also think that these other forms of culture and politics are important too. And so I'm trying to weave those together.
But let me ask you about advancements, because I think a lot of people say, you know, there was the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, and then we had Barack Obama was president. And yet I think I look at history, and obviously you do as well, and you think of poll taxes and disenfranchisement that was going on years ago. And yet now it's going on. I mean, you look at these lines in Georgia and elsewhere. Have we advanced? I mean, where are we?
Right. So, you know, progress is an ongoing process, I think. And so I think that one of the challenges is in this thinking is the nuance. And so, in other words, we have made progress since slavery. We've made progress since Jim Crow, and we've made progress since the modern civil rights movement. Part of the challenge with the progress narrative, however, has been there's a tendency to overstate what that progress has been. And so to use the example, to build upon the example that you led with about voting, so there's a couple things I actually do want to say about voting. So in a wonderful book titled Unaccounted, the author, she traces the modern adaptations of poll taxes, literacy tests, and not that there are literacy tests per se, but her example with poll taxes is the requirement in certain states, including Indiana, and then most of the rest of them are Southern, of having a driver's license or government issued ID, right? And that might be some seemingly simple cost, but if you look at the ways that certain states close access to DMVs or places where they could actually issue state or government issued IDs, then it ended up costing a lot. It's a sort of a tax to be able to exercise one's right to vote. And so in that way, you know, there's that. You look at a place like Georgia and you look at where those polling stations were closed, right? So they were not, so you would have people who would say, oh, I live in Gwinnett County, or I live in Cobb County, affluent counties that are, in some respects, not as white as they once were, but are not predominantly black, as is the case in DeKalb and Fulton. And you don't have those lines that are hours long and whatnot. And so there seems to be a move to curtail people's ability to exercise their rights to vote. And part of that is because in doing that, they're recognizing that voting matters because that's where policy is made, and it is in those policies that you're able to actually keep making some of this progress that I think people like Donald Trump and those in his orbit would suggest need to be rolled back. Like that, those policies need to roll back any type of progress, any type of policy, any type of practice that works to further close the inequity and inequality gaps between whites and blacks, as an example. And so if you recall some of the protests around George Floyd's death that were happening in Atlanta, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, who I think is a wonderful leader in many respects, and I think she's clear-sighted in some of the reforms that she's thinking about and some of her policies. But she said, you know, don't just riot, in her terminology, also vote. But when you look at those lines on the day of the primary, that is the frustration of what people are sort of protesting against. And there's the larger system that you're telling us use our right to vote, and at the same time, our right to vote is being eroded through these long lines, which are designed to discourage one from voting, because the idea is that you won't actually wait, you won't persist to vote, and then your vote won't actually be cast or matter.
Since the death of George Floyd, protests against police brutality continue nationwide, with calls for defunding and demilitarizing police departments. Others, however, including U.S. President Donald Trump, generally defend law enforcement actions and say the cruel police treatment comes from, quote, a few bad apples, end quote. With police under scrutiny, the fundamental question becomes, how are police perceived within a community, and how does that change based on the color of your skin?
What also is of interest is perspective, how you and I view the police. You know, I may look at them and say protect and serve. You may look at them, protect and serve, but how do you protect me from the police? It's a different way of looking at it. Talk to us about that as well.
Exactly. So if we think historically about the police's role, going back to, you know, chattel slavery, and we think about, you know, the slave codes where it was a crime to learn how to read. Right, so when we think about the criminalization of blackness, that process did not begin because black people were being mischievous or breaking the law in the way that we might think of breaking the law in the 21st century. In other words, if learning how to read is the crime, then that's a law that's worth breaking, right?
Absolutely.
And so we think about that. We think about how in Reconstruction, the police, with the help of the Ku Klux Klan, made it their business to terrorize black people who were doing well because perhaps they was thought that they were out of place, right? They had gotten beside themselves, they were uppity, they were, all of these ideas that I think transfer now to the modern moment were very much present then as well. And so historically, black communities have been terrorized by white police officers and law enforcement more generally without cause. So that when we get to the contemporary moment and you think about the 70s and 80s, when in fact perhaps crime is rising, particularly in impoverished communities, Nixon speaking of law and order, Reagan is having a war on drugs, all of these ideas become intermeshed. And what you see is that on the one hand, there are black communities that want to be protected from, you know, drugs ravaging their communities and their loved ones. So that's on the one hand. But how that is enforced, you know, makes a big difference. What does it mean to, for the police to be there and to find someone who's engaged in drugs, either as a distributor or as a consumer, and directs that person out of the community to rehab and then reintegrate that person into the community, versus locking that person away for 20, 30, 40 years, versus killing that person in the process of trying to apprehend. And so the protect and serve has always been a, you know, serve us, we need to be protected from you and by you. And so there is this hesitancy. It's not necessarily the crimes themselves, but it is the financial interest and needing to fund the government, compounded by racism, that enacts these policies and laws that allow the police to over-surveil black people in order to generate revenue. And so historically, at every juncture, the target of policing, over-policing, has been black people.
Do me a favor, and don't make this hard on yourselves. All of you take a seat.
Racial inequality exists throughout the U.S. criminal justice system. A black person is 5 times more likely to be arrested than a white person. Once arrested, they are more likely to be convicted. Once convicted, they are more likely to experience lengthy prison sentences. With roughly 2 million people behind bars, the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, people of color make up more than 50% of those in prison, but account for only 28% of the total U.S. population.
As you have these college students come year in and year out, and you try and mold them, where would you like them to land? The ones that you're the gifted students. Do you want them to be judges? Do you want them to be defense attorneys? Do you want them to be police officers?
Yeah.
Where can we place them in society to make a difference?
This is an interesting question, and I have friends who would disagree with me on this. But I do think that there is potential in the prosecutor's office that sometimes the students I interact with, particularly students of color and black ones, don't always explore, because they want to be defense attorneys. And at that point, their client is already in the criminal justice system. Whereas as a prosecutor, they have enough discretion not to charge the client, so they wouldn't need a defense attorney.
So you could really make a difference there.
I think so. The question though becomes, in order to get to that point, do you have to do too much harm before you're at a place where you're actually making those decisions?
Now with this bill, the voice of justice speaks again. It proclaims that fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
In the more than 50 years since the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, residential segregation between black and white Americans remains high. That segregation matters because it also impacts access to education. A 2019 report by the nonprofit EdBuild found that white school districts receive $23 billion a year more in funding than districts that serve mostly students of color. It means public school students in urban areas who want a better education are left with few options. One is traveling daily to suburban school districts.
You've kind of straddled both worlds. I mean, you lived in the city, you went to school in the suburbs, black friends, white friends. Talk to me about that kind of traversing two worlds.
It was interesting traversing between Hartford, Connecticut, which is the city I grew up in, and still family live there now, and going to a suburban town of Glastonbury, where I had tremendous opportunities and educational opportunities that I think were very beneficial. It was a public school. It was an outstanding public school, and what it gave me access to from there. The interpersonal relationships, though, were challenging. To say that I encountered implicit racism would be an obvious statement, and it was actually probably more explicit than some of those people would care to acknowledge then and now. And so it was interesting to navigate, because I will just say this: where I did make some friends were in places where I think people were recognizing that, you know what, we are different, we have different experiences, but we can actually talk about what those differences and different experiences are, and then actually laying bare some of the assumptions, you know, that we were both making, although I do think the impact of some of those assumptions were different. So that was the case, but I definitely would say that when people saw me then, and this is the more case now, when people see me now, they don't necessarily think of, oh, this person has this degree or whatever the case is. They may think that I come from one of those zip codes that they would not necessarily want to associate with someone having come from. So.
Today, you're a college professor,
I am. Is that something?
and which means you're shaping the future in a sense. You're looking back on the past, but you're also looking to the future.
Yes.
Are you a man who's encouraged by what you see of the college students, and where do we go from here?
The college students, the future, I think, for them, in many respects, looks bright. I think that the college students that I particularly interact with in African American studies, so I think that it's important that I'm a college professor who is in interdiscipline of African American studies that was born in the academy out of the social upheaval, the social unrest, the social consciousness raising of the 1960s, and an interdiscipline whose job is to build or to bridge the gap that might exist sometimes between academia and the quote unquote real world. A department currently whose mission is to train students and equip them with the tools and methodologies that will push forward their move towards justice in society. And so that is, I think, a very exciting process and team to be a part of in African American Studies at Georgetown. And what I have been able to do of late in a more pronounced way is to take those tools and to share them with broader audiences, which I think hopefully our conversation is doing today. And I think that that's an important part of it too. And this exposure with Paths Forward, I think, is critical. And so I'm excited about the potential of what those efforts might yield. And I am honored and grateful for the opportunity to be in spaces where I'm able to do that too.
Well, listening to you, I think we need to extend the day from 24 hours to 25. I don't know how you're doing it all, but I can't thank you enough for talking to us. Really appreciate it.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Anytime. I look forward to future conversations.
Absolutely.
Thank you.